What can we expect from a MIDI controller? And is this KORG Keystage 61 maybe the right one for me? If you look at my room, you might think, as I do, it is starting to get a bit full. I was a bit skeptical to get a new MIDI controller because I didn't have the best experiences with them so far, or with MIDI in general. But having a dedicated keyboard right in front of you, right underneath your screen, is really a workflow booster. My fully weighted 88 key stage piano, my KAI MP7, isn't great for this specific task. Like working the DAW, playing in some notes, going back to the screen, back and forth. It's not the right keyboard for that. So I wanted something that is in front of me, great to enter some notes, play some easy performances, but if I have to record a real piano performance, I can always switch to my 88 key one. I wanted it to have some knobs for plug-in control, as well as some DAW controls and a decent keyboard. Enter the KORG Keystage 61. Is it a good controller? I'm making a long video about it. Actually, since my KORG M1 plugin video, I was in contact with KORG and I was also interested in trying this keyboard, and I have the great opportunity of trying it without really buying it, and I have to think about if I want to keep it, and that's kind of the journey I want to go through with you in this video. Do I want to keep this keyboard? Does it deliver what I would hope a MIDI controller can deliver? But MIDI controllers in general just kind of suck, no? I wish they were better in general. The KORG Keystage has 8 assignable potentiometers, and you can edit which CC they are sending. This value knob right here is sending MIDI program changes, and you can also control this with the value up and down buttons. This is how the buttons sound. I think that's not ideal. I really kind of fell in love with the buttons on this Yamaha Reface DX, which are also clicky but take a lot less force to press. Here you have your standard transport controls: play, stop, record, loop and tempo. And these are some buttons you're going to need to adjust the internal settings. There's also internal chord functionality, which lets you play entire chords with just a single note, going from this to this. And there's an arpeggiator. Features that I personally don't use too much, and I don't have many things to say about them, honestly. And lastly, on the top right here, you have a volume knob. And this is not a MIDI control, this is actually a hardware control for the internal interface. Yes, there's an internal interface in this, and you'll see that there's a headphone output, your standard left-right jack outputs. There's also pedal inputs for sustain and expression, as well as MIDI in and out. Coming from this AKAI MPK Mini Mark II, I didn't have too high hopes for what kind of value a MIDI controller could add to my workflow. But I was interested in this MIDI controller specifically because I hoped the MIDI 2.0 would add something that I was missing so far. These knobs don't do anything by default. And I think that's just the way that MIDI controllers work, right? But I think this is so dumb. Whenever I want to use one of these knobs, I have to map it first. And by the time I mapped a knob, I could have already done what I wanted to do in the first place. Or I could just have drawn an automation by hand. Also, this doesn't have any DAW control, no play, pause or anything. And the keybed is really lacking. Not very fun to play. Good enough if you're traveling in a pinch, okay. Good enough to throw in a backpack, but I don't like working with it. So even for traveling, I ended up taking this along way more frequently. This is a Yamaha Reface CS, not really a MIDI controller. It's a virtual analog basic synthesizer, but the keybed is so much better than this one that I prefer this a lot to play. It's pretty good, not a dedicated MIDI controller though. For example, it doesn't have any mappable knobs. Also, I do have this. This is a Yamaha Piaggero NP11, semi-weighted keybed, 61 keys, so pretty comparable to the KORG one. Not specifically a MIDI controller, this one even does have built-in sounds and a pretty decent keyboard. And talking about keyboards, that's one thing where I'm not 100% sure if I'm happy with the Keystage 61, so I want to do a test. That's why I got all my keyboards out. In Pianoteq, you can do something called calibration. It instructs you to play different velocities, and it then creates a custom velocity curve that fits ideally to your controller. So I want to do this calibration with all of these 6 keyboards and see what Pianoteq says about them. Maybe we can see that some of them need a lot of adjustment for natural playing, and others might respond very linearly already. Because so far when I was playing the Keystage, I was never fully happy and I had to start tweaking the internal velocity curve which we'll look at in a bit. So now I'm going to do this calibration with all 6 keyboards. Alright, these are all the calibrations done. Let's see what we can learn from these graphs. The KORG, pretty straight. The Yamaha, pretty straight, but a different profile definitely. The AKAI also looks pretty straight. Not too bad, right? Here we do have an issue at the top, the KORG one. That's something I suspected to see. And then the Yamaha, pretty straight. And the Keith Macmillan also has some issues. One thing to get out of the way first. This test doesn't really tell us as much as I would hope. Because if I try to play mezzo forte like a regular medium volume, for example, on this Keith Macmillan keyboard, you can see how all over the place these lines are that indicate what volume I'm playing. I'm trying to play the same velocity on all keys. But we have kind of an even spread from 0 to 127 velocity. And that's why it's very difficult to play precisely on this Keith Macmillan. If you compare this to the KORG MP7, which doesn't have a perfectly straight line, you're probably going to notice that the groupings of the velocities I'm playing are going to be way tighter. I'm also going to try to play mezzo forte, medium velocity. This is definitely a way closer grouping than we had with the Keith Macmillan, which hopefully is the case because it's also way more expensive, right? But I would really appreciate a good high quality keyboard as my main MIDI controller. And this is a candidate that I tried to have on my desk for some time. It's also not a MIDI controller though, and it has one fatal flaw, and that's why I was looking for something different. It doesn't have any mod or pitchbend wheels. Especially for my MIDI controller, which I'm going to use for more synthesizer focused things, I really need this mod and pitchbend wheel to be happy. Enter the KORG Keystage 61. 61 key semi-weighted synth actiony keys with Polyphonic Aftertouch. Interesting. Modwheel, pitchbend wheel, some assignable knobs, transport controls, the basic things I want from my MIDI controller. But still I was skeptical because of this one. These knobs, I can't work with these. You always have to map them first. And these knobs promise something different. They promise MIDI 2.0. And honestly, I don't fully understand what MIDI 2.0 is, and I don't want to. All I knew was basically MIDI 2.0 lets your DAW communicate better with your keyboard. And I would love if my DAW would just tell my MIDI controller, control this parameter, and I don't have to map anything ever. I would love that. So, no more MIDI mapping. Does this keyboard deliver on this promise? No. Also, it was never promised. I was basically just hoping it would do that, but it doesn't do that at all. It does something similar, but only really with Ableton Live. When you open Ableton Live, you will see that the keystage indicates clearly that there's nothing loaded at the moment and that these knobs control nothing at the moment. But let's say we drag a new instrument into this project and you see the preset name labeled right here. And all of these knobs got assigned automatically to a parameter. This one controls the oscillator waveform. This one controls the shape of oscillator 1. This one controls the octave of oscillator 1. So all 8 knobs got assigned automatically. And it's not that easy to change this assignment from what I figured out. I'm saying automatically, it's not really happening automatically. They just already mapped them for this controller. You'll see this if you, for example, get a third-party plugin. Let's get a Cherry Audio Synth. Now it recognizes correctly that this is a DCO 106, but the controls aren't mapped yet to anything. To get parameters to show up here, you have to hit this configure button and then control any parameter you want to have on your keyboard. For example, the frequency of the filter is now visible here in your Ableton rec and also on your keyboard automatically. I think this is pretty cool, not as seamless as I would have hoped, but better than nothing. Honestly though, the main difference between this keyboard, due to its MIDI 2.0 capability, and another one that doesn't have MIDI 2.0, seems to be that it is labeled right here what you're actually controlling. And that only works with Live. For example, my personal DAW Studio One is not fully supported. Also, the choice to put program change on this big value knob, I don't know if I understand it. Because not too many plugins do anything with MIDI program change. it's kind of an outdated thing, or if it's still up to date, at least nobody's using it, right? So I don't think it was smart to put this feature on this prominent, big, nice to use knob. If we compare this to my primary DAW Studio One, you'll see that from the get-go we have a different experience. Right here it doesn't say the instrument, it just says the program from the program change wheel, and right here it just says the CC value that these parameters are controlling. Usually you have control over all CC values from 0 to 128, and you can switch through the different values with these page buttons. But there are also presets for this. If you hold shift page, you're controlling the scenes, and you see right here, now it's the up6 scene, now it's the Modwave scene, now it's the micro KORG scene, and for example with this Triton scene, you'll have pre-selected CC values right here, which work well with the Triton plugin or standalone app. And if you want to make your own scenes, you can do this with the KORG control editor. But this doesn't actually work very well inside Studio One either, because the way Studio One handles CC values is a bit non-standard from what I understand. Anyways, if you select a different DAW, make sure you go to settings and switch the controller mode to the DAW you're using, for example Studio One. And even if I load a stock synth in here, for example, it doesn't recognize this. It just still says program 1. That's because of this program change knob. That doesn't really do anything with most plugins or DAWs. But I saved parameters I want to control in this synth manually. And now whenever I load this plugin, I can automatically control some parameters that I pre-selected. But it doesn't show the names right here, which is the main difference to live, I think. But I had to set this up manually, the same way you would usually do it with any MIDI controller in Studio One. So MIDI 2.0 is not really doing anything for me here. Also, the choice to use potentiometers up here instead of endless encoders with something that should be auto-mapping and give you like instance access to some parameters, I feel was a pretty big oversight. We'll get into that. But overall, I have to say, hardware-wise, I was pretty happy when I first unboxed this thing. It has pretty much the ports I want, the layout of knobs and buttons I want, and I basically wanted something like my Yamaha keyboard, but with Pitchbend and Modwheels, which this one definitely does have. I don't love the feel of them though. First of all, I feel they're a bit slippery. Like this indentation isn't as easy to grab as I would hope. And the smooth surface finish just doesn't make it like as tactile of an experience to play with these Modwheels. Also, from the start, it felt like they were kind of grinding up against the sides. And they felt scratchy to use, honestly. Like there's a weird resistance in it. And somehow they don't feel perfectly straight the way they slotted in. And now there's some sort of friction that shouldn't be there. My KAI back here does this a lot better. It has like a very heavy texture on the Pitchbend and Modwheels, and also there's no friction at all. The Keystage comes with many different softwares. On KORG's website you can download a system update, a script for your DAW if it needs one, the KORG control editor, as well as a MIDI driver and audio driver. But I have to say, it wasn't a very smooth experience to set everything up. Everything mostly works plug and play, so I wasn't even sure if I should download all the drivers. And after I installed the MIDI driver, the keyboard stopped working completely, even though beforehand it was working pretty well. So maybe skip downloading the MIDI driver with this one. This was due to a pretty old issue that Tim Shoebridge gladly solved in this video that I'm going to link in the description. So if you encounter an issue after installing the MIDI driver, you're not alone and there's a fix for it. Pretty annoying though, and not a great first impression. Also you get some cards like this in the box which have codes for free software. And I got Wavestate Native LE, a bundle of third-party plugins, and the KORG Gadget Producer bundle. This one confused me a lot though, honestly. Because KORG Gadget seems to be a music production software, a DAW, and I was kind of excited to have a program that specifically works well with the Keystage together, but I tried over and over to install it and it never showed up on my system, and after a lot of trial and error I found out that this is actually only available for iOS and Mac and not for Windows. And I'm working on Windows, but I installed something, so I was really confused, like what did I install? Where is this program? Why can't I find it? Why can't I even install it if there's no Windows version? Well, it turns out the thing I downloaded was just a pretty big bundle of KORG plugins that you can use in any DAW. This is honestly not bad. right? Now I just have a bunch of additional KORG plugins. Some of them are like mini versions of the more famous KORG plugins like the M1 or the Wavestate or something like that. But it was just all a bit confusing when I had to install it, and also the activation process was kind of crazy. I don't remember exactly what I had to do, but it wasn't very intuitive, kind of outdated. So on the software side, not a great first impression with the KORG Keystage. But the highlights of the included software are definitely Wavestate Native LE, and with this one the installation process was no issue at all, as well as Applied Acoustic Systems Sessions bundle. So you get Lounge Lizard Session, Ultra Analog Session, and Strum Session. 3 pretty cool physical modeling plugins. And interestingly, I'm ranting a bit in this video about the prominent program change knob right here. This feature works really well with the Applied Acoustic Systems plugins. Switch to preset, and with most KORG plugins like the Wavestate Native, it also works. Let's compare 2 keys that are kind of comparable in looks and build quality wise, the Keystage 61 and the Yamaha Piaggero NP11. KORG Keystage. The spread of velocity ranges is pretty tight, comparable to the KAI. But you see this flat spot up here? This means without this plugin compensating, I couldn't even hit the highest velocity layers with the velocity curve 0. You do have the option to select between different velocity curves from -10 to +10 compared to the Yamaha. Let's see the spread on that. Alright, it doesn't feel the most consistent, but it definitely feels a tiny bit better to play loud notes. And I think also to play very soft notes. Let's go back to the KORG. With this custom velocity curve, it feels very nice to play these soft notes. I think it's also maybe something combined with the aftertouch, that if you really hit these keys, it just doesn't feel the most confidence-inspiring. And you see, I would never be able to reach the top velocity. But as I said, we can adjust the velocity curve of the Keystage internally, but sadly not as detailed as I would hope. You can see here how the different velocity curves look according to KORG themselves. And if we want to reach some of the higher velocities a bit more easily, we have to go to Settings, Second Page, and then turn up the velocity curve into the positive direction. Let's do that Pianoteq calibration again with velocity curve 6. As you can see, we still have trouble to reach above 119 velocity, but it got harder to play some of the softer velocity, so it's a trade-off. The more adjustment this plugin has to do, the worse the velocity curve is going to feel if we play with a different plugin that doesn't have this adjustment built in. So while the KORG Keystage might not have the best keyboard in regards to expressive playing with velocity layers, or like a natural piano-like touch, it does have something that many other controllers don't have going on with the keyboard, and that is Polyphonic Aftertouch. Let me show you some plugins with which I really enjoy using Polyphonic Aftertouch. For example, MSoundFactory. If you go to the globals page, you can just increase use pressure, and then it will just work. With the instrument power strings, you're controlling the expression when you increase the poly pressure. Which is really useful for giving some more authenticity to strings, because they don't just stay the same volume throughout. If I turn off Poly Aftertouch again, I have a lot less control over the expression compared to with it on. Another plugin that works really well with Polyphonic Aftertouch is Baby Audio Atoms. I even made a whole video about how I didn't really like this plugin before I had this Polyphonic Aftertouch keyboard, because the sounds just felt a bit flat. And now with the Polyphonic Aftertouch, it gets a lot more fun to play. In Studio One, even with the stock instruments, you can make some great use out of Polyphonic Aftertouch by going to the mod matrix, for example in Presence, selecting the poly pressure, and then I could, for example, route it to pitch via the LFO1. And then use it to introduce some vibrato when I press down on a key. No Polyphonic Aftertouch, with Polyphonic Aftertouch. I think that's pretty nice. But I think my favorite thing to do with Polyphonic Aftertouch is to use it to control the pitch. Basically, the harder I press down, the more a note is going to be pitched up. I think this is cool if you tune it so that it's exactly a full step. And setting up something like this basically lets you turn your Polyphonic Aftertouch keyboard into a budget MPE controller. This is so fun to play. You can do a similar thing with Cherry Audio synths. For example, I set up the same thing with Dreamsynth. I'm not sure if this is the best way to do it, but I just used the Poly Aftertouch to control the tune of every oscillator independently. So, and if you set it to 3.5, around there, it's pretty much exactly bending it up a whole step. A lot of fun to play. Aftertouch also works well with, for example, KORG's own Prophecy. To close out the video, I want to talk a bit about the Keystage's internal interface. The internal interface might make this keyboard ideal for live performers or people who just want to jam. I can set up something to play with just with my laptop and this keyboard. It even has this stand. You can see in theory even my 16-inch laptop fits onto the Keystage. And it kind of works. It's slightly too small for my bigger laptop. And now it's all just powered from the laptop's internal battery. And I can go plug in some headphones. Here is the volume knob and you're ready to go. And standalone KORG apps like this KORG Triton right here can maybe give you an experience similar to something like Arturia's Astrolab, in the sense that you get a hardware device that kind of works with software sounds, and for the most part it's a pretty optimized integration. I showed you the scenes earlier. If we now switch to the Triton scene, these first 4 knobs are ideal to control these 4 real-time controls that the Triton plugins have. I'm going to plug the Keystage into some speakers. can switch the preset like this. So you can see I can play with KORG sounds, only really with interacting with the Keystage, and I never really have to use the laptop for anything if I don't want to. Just broadly speaking, if you want to do some fine adjustments, or if you want to select a specific preset, of course you're going to have to use the laptop with this setup, but I think this combination of KORG standalone apps combined with the Keystage is a pretty satisfying experience, and one that I could imagine is similar to an Astrolab. You also get this little control panel for the Keystage interface, and I think it's a pretty huge bummer that the interface in here is only 44.1 kilohertz. I think it's not a huge deal, but usually I work with 48 kilohertz, and my laptop, I think most laptops probably run on 48 kilohertz, so it would be nicer if it had at least 48 kilohertz, so the switching back and forth from internal sound card processing to external sound card processing would be a bit smoother. Also, it's not particularly low latency. I mean, I can make a very low buffer size here, but depending on the laptop you have, that might not be sustainable. So usually I work with 96 samples. If we check out the integration with KORG standalone apps and the Keystage, I think it's a bit disappointing that even with the Wavestate native LE, there's nothing like we had with Ableton Live. It doesn't communicate with the app, it doesn't recognize what parameters it is controlling. It is simply controlling these macro knobs up here, which is fine. It's a good workflow, but it would of course be way nicer if I would actually see what I was controlling right here, and it would make it even more comparable to something like the Arturia Astrolab. Also, currently I have a microphone plugged into this laptop as well, but sadly the interface in here doesn't have any inputs at all, so I have to use another interface anyways. Let's also talk about the transport controls. They work as you would expect. In Studio One you can't tap tempo, which is a bit weird, but all of these controls right here, see if you have this setup where it's right next to your keyboard. Am I really going to press play right here instead of here? This is an even more convenient location than this over here. I can press play, I can press record, I can turn off and on the metronome. So in this specific setup, I'm a bit surprised to say that the transport controls are kind of superfluous. In a different setup, they might be very valuable. So I've tried to examine in as much detail as reasonable what I think is good about the Keystage, what I think could be better about the Keystage. And now the question, do I want to keep it? If you remember at the beginning of the video, I talked about how I was able to try it without really having to buy it because of my connections with KORG. And now I have to answer this question for myself. Honestly, it is a privilege to try it without actually having to buy it. But if I had bought it with my own money, I would have stopped thinking if it's good enough to keep a long time ago. And I would just have accepted that this is the MIDI key that I bought and that I now use and that I now spend time learning and understanding. And it's definitely a great workflow improvement to have it over not having anything like it. So if I weren't in this privileged position, The answer would be extremely simple. Yes, I want to keep it. But because I have now had the chance to explore it in detail and pick apart all its strengths and weaknesses, it is not that easy to answer the question. Let me try to summarize my opinions in a pro and cons style list. Major pro, the Polyphonic Aftertouch. I really enjoy working with Polyphonic Aftertouch, and now that I've experienced it, I don't think I want to lose it again. A con? It is kind of pricey, around $600 to $700 for the 61 key version. I think you can find it cheaper in many stores, but that's the list price. And I think it has some features like the internal interface or Aftertouch that maybe make it worth that price. But if you look at the competition, I think you can find similar quality, similar features for a lot less money. So let's say you can find a good MIDI key, 61 keys for around $300. Is it really worth paying $200 to $300 to $400 more for the interface and the Aftertouch? And the MIDI 2.0. But let's get to the MIDI 2.0. That's neither a pro nor a con. I think you should just ignore it completely. It's not a feature that I was able to make use of in any way. Maybe if you use Ableton Live, that might be something to do with MIDI 2.0, and that might be a selling point for you. But if you don't use Ableton Live, then MIDI 2.0 just don't have it on your pro cons list in the first place. Another pro, I think, is the integration with the KORG standalone apps. If you are somebody that really wants to jam with KORG sounds and isn't really that much into producing or working with DAWs, this could actually be something like a poor man's Astrolab. Let's also finish talking about the interface. That's a pro in some sense, but for me personally, it's not a lot of value that it's adding. Maybe if I would play live more with more software sounds, yes. But, and this is another con, the keybed is just not good enough for me to where I would ever want to use it as my only or main keyboard on a stage. I'm used to playing stage pianos, fully weighted hammer action keys. I play a lot of piano sounds, like actual grand piano style playing. That's why I really want those fully weighted keys. But if you're somebody that plays more with synthesizers, pads, leads, synth solos, I think you should actually consider the Keystage to play live. I think for sounds like those, the touch of it is perfectly fine. On the topic of playing live though, the knobs should really be endless encoders, because now if you would switch from one preset to the next between songs and then you have this automation you want to do while playing, you will always have to go and search for the position that your knob is, and the parameters are going to jump around, and especially live on stage, this is kind of a big deal. The transport controls are another pro. Maybe you can see right here the blinking of the tempo button though. I was worried in the beginning that I might find it a bit irritating that it is really blinking constantly. It will really never stop blinking. I kind of do enjoy that the record button lights up red though when you're recording. In the beginning of the video I said MIDI controllers just kind of suck, no? And I kind of stand by that. And with that context, I think even if I don't love the Keystage as much as I would hope, it's maybe a bit unfair to expect so much of it. Because I think I just feel the limitations of what MIDI technology or DAWs or the integration between VSTs and a host and MIDI and things, I think I just feel the limitations of all these technologies interacting. For example, let's talk again about the program change function. Why isn't there a universal way that I can change presets in every plugin? I think there should be something standardized, and then they could put a wheel or a button on this keyboard or on any MIDI keyboard, and if I hit it, next preset. I hit it, next preset. And the way program change works doesn't do this in the best way, because you have to assign a preset to a specific program number and there's a limited amount. That's not going to work with most plugins. I just want a button that does next preset, previous preset. Most plugins have those buttons as software, but why don't they have like a standardized language, a standardized MIDI, and then everything just works? Sadly, that's not the case. Another thing where I think the technology is not as refined as it could or should be is with, and I've talked a lot about this, MIDI mapping. My dream of MIDI 2.0, just auto-mapping everything, is not here yet. My suggestion would be something like, why doesn't a plugin developer decide which parameters are the most important and then list them in order of importance? And if you don't intervene, if you don't manually map anything, a controller will always say, all right, knob 1, most important parameter, is mapped. Let's go. Knob 2, second most important parameter as determined by the plugin's developer. Automatically mapped, let's go. Same with all the other controls, like with a subtractive synth. The parameter number 1 will always be the filter, something like this. And MIDI 2.0 then can just be used to show the names of those parameters on the device. So I see filter, resonance, anything. I really miss features like this, and that's why I am a bit disappointed by MIDI controllers in general. But to be fair, that's really most of my gripes with MIDI, and aside from that, I think MIDI is pretty cool. Yeah. It's old technology though, let's be real. Alright, that was a video that took me forever to make. Maybe you've seen it with my facial hair change, my hair length change, my wardrobe changes. And now I think I'm going to tell my KORG guys that I would like to keep the Keystage. Thanks for providing me with the Keystage. If you want a MIDI keyboard and you want one that has Polyphonic Aftertouch, consider the Keystage. And if you want one that has a built-in interface, consider the Keystage. And if you use Ableton Live and you want some good integration, consider the Keystage. And if you want to play the piano with a piano-like play feel on a fully weighted 88-key keyboard, then I wouldn't consider the Keystage. Thank you very much for watching. Consider subscribing, leave a like, and see you again soon. Hopefully. Bye.